Hey, what's up guys? Hope you're doing well. Welcome back to Life on the Wrist. So I thought we would start a series where we discuss all things vintage watches. I think it's something that there hasn't been a lot of traction with kind of a series where you kind of get taught about vintage watches. Obviously, as you probably know, vintage watches are extremely popular right now. Right now is auction season, so obviously vintage watches are on people's minds consistently. Some of our other videos we're going to discuss the vintage watches that sold at auction this week, so stay tuned for those, but those are later this week. But it seems like there isn't a series where you can just watch straight through and learn everything that you need to know about vintage watches. Obviously there is an infinite amount of knowledge that you can get about vintage watches. This is just kind of the entry-level steps into being able to talk about them, know what people are referring to when they do discuss vintage watches, and I thought I would be the one to try and give you that information in a very concise manner. So we're going to be starting a series called Learning About Vintage Watches. This is going to be episode 1. In episode 1, I thought in order to kind of set the stage for future episodes, we should probably go over the anatomy of a watch and one very, very important word that is used by many people when it comes to vintage watches that you probably should be aware of. So that's kind of what our plan is for this video. Before we get into that, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Life on the Wrist, we create videos about watches, so if you are interested in those types of videos, check out our channel for the other videos. Also, be sure to hit that like button for us, it really does help us out. So, like I said, we're going to talk about the anatomy of a watch, and then kind of talk about a word that is used and thrown around a little bit too much in vintage watches, but it's something that you should be aware of because it is used so frequently. So, looking at the anatomy of a watch, obviously, if you are looking at your wristwatch or a pocket watch, the first thing that you're going to notice is what a lot of people call the face. That's where basically the top side of your watch. That is actually called the dial of the watch. The dial is simply the piece on top of the watch that is the display that looks back at you of the watch. So very, very simply, the face of the watch is what some people call the dial. Within the dial, there are these things called subdials. Subdials are little circles or little apertures on the actual face or the dial of the watch that have a separate function or complication. As an example, if you have a chronograph, a lot of the times there are 3 subdials on the watch. The subdials are the little 3 circles that can be seen on it, on the dial, and it will give you a different type of reading. So if you start your chronograph, one of the subdials may be a 30-minute counter. That is considered a subdial complication, and it's something that is added onto the dial. And obviously, being that the dial is on top of the movement, which is the mechanical basically powerhouse of your watch, those movements are added into those complications are within that movement that obviously power the dial. So we've gone over the dial of the watch, the subdials that can be seen on the watch. Next is the hands. Hands are basically any type of stick that is on the dial of the watch. The most common hands that are used are the hour and minute hands. Obviously, there's also a second hand that rotates. I will take my memo sail off so that you can see it. You will see the chronograph hand running. The orange hand is rotating right now, but you can also see the longer hand, which is the hour hand, and the shorter hand, which is the shorter hand is the hour hand, the longer hand is the minute hand. So hands are basically ways that complications can be shown to you on the dial of the watch. So again, the dial is the thing that looks back at you. The subdials are little circles or little complications on top of the dial, and then the hands are the ways in which you can read the complications on the watch. The next thing is the crown. The crown is the winding mechanism on the side of the watch, or at least on this memo sail, it is on the side of the watch. The crown can really be located anywhere, but this is the most common location of it. The crown is used to adjust the hands on the watch, but it is also used in hand winding movements to wind your watch in order to get power into the movement so that the complications can work. So the crown is a little piece on the side. The case of the watch is obviously the big chunk of metal that is sitting on your wrist. The entire thing is called the case. It basically encases the movement, the dial. All the pieces of the watch are encased in the metal structure that sits on your wrist. That's a very simple one. The next term that we should go over is the bezel of the watch. The bezel is the outer ring of the watch. It usually goes on the outside of the watch around the dial of the watch. A lot of the times in vintage watches, bezels can be an extremely important part of whether or not you like the watch, but also an extremely important part of the way in which the watch ages, which we'll get into. So that is the bezel. The lugs, unfortunately this memo sale does not have lugs. However, the lugs are the pieces of metal that come off of the case that allows a strap or bracelet to be attached to the case of the watch. These are typically on wristwatches. If you're looking at a pocket watch, there are normally not lugs on a wristwatch. So the lugs are the pieces of metal that allow you to attach a bracelet or strap to the watch. Speaking of a bracelet or a strap is basically a piece of metal or nylon or whatever type of material you want that allows for the wristwatch to sit on your wrist. So this is a leather strap that I have on this memo sale. You probably think it looks strange. Yes, it is an 18 millimeter strap on a 22 millimeter wide lug width. But that's another story. If you want to see why I decided to do this, check out our Instagram, which is Life on the Wrist. And the last thing is the movement of the watch. The movement is, and I kind of mentioned this previously, the movement is the mechanical structure that was put together by a watchmaker that powers the watch and allows for you to tell time. So I hope those terms were useful and you kind of followed along. I'll be sure to kind of put up some annotated drawings and some videos so that you can see pieces of a watch. These terms are extremely important when you're having conversations about watches because you know, if you can't refer to something that is on a watch, then it's kind of hard to kind of engage in conversations about watches. So just to recap, a very quick recap, the dial is the face of the watch that looks back at you. The subdials are complications that are little circles that are on top of the dial that allow you to read a different type of complication. The hands are the sticks on the dial that allow you to read the time. The crown is the piece on the side of the watch that allows you to wind the watch and also change the time. The case is the piece of metal. The entire watch is the case. The bezel is the piece of the outer ring of the dial of the watch. The lugs are the pieces that allow you to attach a bracelet to a watch. Pieces of metal that come out of the case. Strap or bracelet is the way that you attach your watch to your wrist via the lugs. If it's a strap, it's obviously some type of material. If it's a bracelet, it's typically metal. And the movement is what powers the watch. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about the movements behind watches, we've explained all the different types of movements that you can possibly have in a wristwatch. So be sure to check out those videos in our channel. So I hope that kind of gave you an idea of the anatomy of a watch. You're a little bit more familiar with the parts of a watch and can perhaps talk a little bit more about it. I should mention one thing with this one. These two pushers here are the chronograph pushers. These are things that start a stopwatch within a watch. So if I press the top one, the stopwatch of this watch starts. If I press it again, it stops. And if I press the bottom pusher here, it will reset the watch. So the one word that is used so frequently within vintage watches is the word patina. Patina is basically, as a watch ages, different parts of the watch will react with the surroundings in a different way and will transform, it will kind of transform and show a little bit of the age as the watch interacts with its surroundings. As an example, a lot of people talk about how the patina of a dial can occur. So if we put those two words together, the dial is the face of the watch that looks back at you when you are looking at it, and patina of the dial means there was age on that dial. A lot of the times patina dials can look almost like a tropical brown color. The word is actually used as tropical, a tropical patina. of a dial. It basically just means that the dial has gone from a black color to a brown kind of sun-kissed color. A lot of the times this happens when the dial of the watch is exposed to a lot of sunlight. The dial ends up oxidizing and can change color. Patina is something that has become extremely, I would say, controversial within pricing of watches. There are varying levels of patina, as you probably imagine. Age can occur, aging of a dial or aging of a watch can occur in various levels. And for some people want a very even, just very simple patina to a dial, but others actually like the fact when it's kind of a little bit more beat up, a little bit more uneven. It gives it a little bit more character, which is why I think patina is extremely polarizing, and it is actually an extremely personal taste when it comes to vintage watches. If you are someone who likes that beautiful chocolate, just chocolate brown, very even patina, then you probably fall on one end of the spectrum. But if you are someone who wants a dial that perhaps was in the ocean, a watch that was in the ocean and perhaps reacted with some salt water that got into it, but then it was restored by the manufacturer, but it has this very interesting look to it, that type of patina is someone completely different. So patina is personal, but at the end of the day, patina is simply the aging of a watch. It doesn't have to just be the dial, it can also be the case. There are different ways that different parts of the watch can patina or age. And I think that's what makes the variety of vintage watches so appealing to many of us. So I hope this helped you kind of get a little bit of a foundation of learning about vintage watches. I hope you kind of understand the anatomy of a watch as well as what patina refers to. In the next episode, we're probably going to go over a few more nuances within kind of the general vintage watch world, go through a few terms and kind of describe them, give you some examples so that you can take them to conversations when you're talking about vintage watches. That's going to be in episode 2, so stay tuned for that. If there's anything you think I missed within the anatomy of a watch or describing patina, be sure to leave it in the comments section below. Really, it will help out the community who are trying to learn about vintage watches. I'm looking forward to episode 2. I think this is a really cool topic that we can kind of discuss together and grow together. I'll probably learn some things from you. And if you've made it this far and you haven't already, be sure to smash that like button for us. It really does help us out. And with that said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. And